And today we're pleased to welcome Steve Wallace from Indiana University, and he's going to be talking about NSF-funded CC project to create mini science DMZs. So I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thank you, Jason. As Jason said, we're going to talk about something I call the MiniDMZ, or Mini Science DMZ. And I am enterprise network architect at IU, and I've been involved in IU's internal and external network efforts for a long time. First, I want to say something about some of the important people in this project. I've got two graduate students who are currently contributing to the project, and it's really wonderful to work with graduate students. They're both master's students at IU, and they'll be leaving the end of this semester. I think both of them are going to be interning at a big company that you all would know if you watch movies or buy anything. And it's been an excellent experience to work with folks that have a younger perspective and are sharp and want this to work well. So how did this happen? I mentioned that I'm a network architect at IU, and we were in the process of developing a network master plan update for Indiana University. And through that process, we interviewed stakeholders, both at the Bloomington campus and at other campuses at IU, to try to get a sense of what were the current uses, what were some unmet needs, what could we anticipate in the future, that kind of thing. And we ran into sort of a particular use case that was very common in many of the labs. And it had to do with their scientific instruments and how they were able or not able to connect them to the network, and what problems they presented both to their work, the vulnerability of their instruments, which may not let them usefully connect them to the network, and as well as complying with the security policies of the university. So today, all instruments are computers. So if you look at microscope, flow cytometer, DNA sequencers, all of them are controlled by a computer, and frequently it's either a standalone computer that maybe has a specialized interface in it and is running special software to control the instrument. In some cases, they're actually embedded computers that are running in the device itself, although those seem to be less common. More common were, you had a separate Windows computer that ran the instrument. And it could be running an old version of Windows, and it was probably the case that you could not patch the system. So this Windows system came from the factory with the instrument, and you were not able to sort of change its Windows configuration, couldn't upgrade it, couldn't patch it. So generally, these systems are highly vulnerable. They're located throughout campus. So this is a ubiquitous problem. You can't just go to the chemistry department and find them all. Everyone has these. And they come in different forms. They come in sort of forms you would think would be medical devices. So we have researchers that have CAT scan machines and MRIs, but they're not part of any clinical healthcare facility. And so, you might be a little surprised to have something like this. And, instruments are where data is born, and instruments are becoming more sophisticated. They all expect them to connect to the network. If these instruments are compromised, it depends on whether they're under a maintenance contract, sort of what the expectations are for the user. So a typical case is perhaps an NSF project or some other opportunity helps a researcher acquire an expensive instrument. And one of the choices they have to make is whether they're going to continue to pay maintenance on that instrument, which can be pretty pricey. And these instruments might last a long time, in which case maintenance might not even be available. And if those instruments are compromised, not only does it potentially create a security problem for other devices, as maybe the compromise will spread laterally within a network, but the instrument can be expensive to disinfect, because what it may mean is that you've got to call the manufacturer and say, I know I haven't covered maintenance on this, but now I need to have this thing wiped clean to use the instrument, and that can be pretty expensive. These instruments are also small enough and end-user friendly enough. Let me qualify it. The IT part is end-user friendly enough so the instrument might require specialized knowledge to prepare samples or to operate, but the computer part of it is relatively easy. And so you might have a lab specialist who knows how to run this kind of instrument, but that lab specialist might not be an IT infrastructure specialist. So their ability to maintain a secure environment won't necessarily be at the same level as a group that's supporting just cyber infrastructure for science workflows. And again, data is born in the instruments, so the data that we have gets turned into ones and zeros at the instrument. So it's kind of an interesting place. You think about it, of the birthplace of a lot of the data that we have today. So the other interesting thing is when we talk to the stakeholders and how they use their instruments, it's in most every case we saw, there's nothing that at the instrument preserves the provenance of the data it's creating. So there's no stamp, there's nothing that says this is exactly what this instrument collected, and here's a way to detect if this information has been intentionally altered or accidentally altered, or we're missing some of it. There's nothing like that. There is varying levels of metadata that gets created with these instruments. I'd say the most common type of metadata is encoded in the file name or the directory name or the directory structure where the data is stored. And the meaning of that and how to interpret that is completely local to the set of users who are using that instrument. And these are relatively small files, and they're not shared. So when we think of large data sets, like collected by huge instruments, there's a community of people who have gotten together and figured out how to make that data available to lots of researchers. So large instrument, we don't have one in every researcher's office. So there's an effort made to figure out how to disseminate that data and how to make that data broadly useful. Well, in the case of these instruments, the smaller instruments are in the labs, there isn't that kind of community support, because if this researcher has a flow cytometry, another researcher at another institution has their own. I mean, that's not always the case, but it's likely. They'll want to save their data, and especially if it's in support of science, and they'll want to make that data available. In some cases, they have to make that data available. But again, there's no universal mechanism to support. The metadata is one huge problem I think everybody's aware of. But the other problem that we saw that was interesting, being a naive observer, is there was nothing to ensure that some data file down the scientific process actually contains the same data that the instrument collected. So another problem, if you do attach an instrument to the network, it's not necessarily reasonable if you're trying to diagnose network impairments that you can test in the instrument itself, and you don't want to install diagnostic software on the instrument. So, if you're gonna be messing around with something in front of the instrument, it might be a good idea to include at that point the ability to do some testing. So, one of the thoughts we had as we're looking at this is we could also include, if we're going to put some device here to solve a set of problems, some perfSONAR capability that can be used in understanding performance, testing the performance to these devices. So this is sort of a typical instrument. This is a flow cytometer. And in this room, there are about, I think, 10 different flow cytometers, different shapes and sizes. This was the biggest one in this room. Some are quite small, some are not much larger than a desktop computer. An interesting part of this one is if you look at the labels on the chair, and I think I have a close-over picture of that, Biosafety Level 2 protocols are required when users are interacting with this instrument. So if you were in the room, one thing I don't think you see in the picture, no. So if you're in this room, there's a taped line that provides sort of a border, a visual border, that when you enter, you have to abide by certain protocols to ensure that germs or material or whatever is not going in and out of the space that this instrument resides in. And so, for example, I think you're required to don gloves to type on the keyboard. And this particular instrument at one time, what I believe was connected to the campus network and was owned, and is no longer connected to the campus network. So to get data from this instrument to the next step in the science workflow requires that the operator use a thumb drive and take that thumb drive from that instrument, put to the instrument, collect the data, take the thumb drive, remove it, put it on another workstation that's connected to the campus network, and then push that data to a storage area that the researchers will then use in the processing of that file. So in this particular case, the woman who operates the lab facility has a set of thumb drives that she keeps in a plastic bag and has bleach wipes. So, this is kind of an extreme case because the instrument cannot be connected to the network. There is a sneaker net that she uses to get data to and from the instrument, and just, because of the bi-level containment protocol, she's got to literally wipe down the drive, and she keeps a set of these drives in a Ziploc bag in her desk. And that's how she maintains this protocol to ensure that nothing gets in and out of there. This is another instrument. This is an electron microscope. So in the previous example, I know this is a big one, but like I said, there's smaller ones in this room. This room has like 10 of them, and some of them are pretty small. And we saw all kinds of instruments that were, maybe the size of a server or something like that. And those pop up everywhere on campus because they can put them, they can put them in a lab. When you get to the electron microscope, it's a little bit different story. And in fact, the room that it's in was either constructed or renovated to actually house this instrument. And this instrument, while this is one example of an instrument that has pretty high data throughput requirements, or will have, doesn't have right now, but will be upgraded to the point where it will have those requirements. All the other instruments we looked at, the data, the amount of data they collected was pretty modest. And even when we talked to people who were doing MRIs, that we would start the conversation and they would say, yeah, we've got a lot of data. And when we'd say, well, can we look at and see what lot means? And a large study might be a couple gigabytes of data. So most of these instruments generated relatively little data, and in fact, this electron microscope doesn't generate a lot of data. However, they're going to change the sensor so that it can take movies, essentially, and it has the potential, when they get to that point and they're in their production runs, they're going to be able to generate 500 megabits per second continuously. So when we're thinking about a solution for this, some of the capabilities that we thought would be important, we'd like to have centralized configuration management. We wanted the physical device to be really small. We wanted it to be able to scale so that we could put it in more of a one-use server platform for the electron microscopes. But in most cases, the data requirements were very little. And really the compute capacity for the things we imagine this box doing were very modest. We wanted to offer firewall intrusion detection, facilitate moving data to the science workflow. That turns out to be pretty hard to do because for these small instruments, the workflow is ad hoc, and sort of just it's whatever is comfortable for the operator of the instrument, and the same instrument doing what seems to me similar stuff can be used in radically different ways, and that's been a hard thing to get around. I talked about there's no provenance. There's no way to tell if the data has been changed. And so one feature capability we want to have is the ability to sign the data, to digitally sign the data. Not encrypt the data, because that presents a whole another set of problems in terms of dealing with a key infrastructure, but digitally signing it. So at least you could assert that the data has not changed, that the data I'm working with right now really was generated by instrument XYZ, a year and a half ago, and I know it hasn't been changed. Again, network test point, we want to be able to do partial perfSONAR node, the test components of that. And we also thought about doing some protocol proxy stuff. So when we talked to the researchers who use traditional medical imaging instruments, they support a DICOM, file formatting in kind of a protocol called DICOM, and there are proxies for DICOM. And one of the ways to address securing those devices is you can essentially put a proxy in front of them and secure the proxy. A small form factor, we're imagining something that you could physically connect to the instrument. These instruments were mobile, so they're DNA sequencers, flow cytometers, microscopes that might move around. Some are on carts. Some might be placed on the counter in a wet lab, and where it was placed is just where the power was. I mean, they might move it, the next week. We actually had a case where folks maintaining some instruments in the chemistry department suggested that they would like to superglue the cable from this to their instruments controller. So here's the case they came into. The graduate students were using an instrument. They had a problem with using the instrument. They contacted the manufacturer, and they said, you need to install an update. So they put the computer on the network. So they moved, they actually plugged it into a normal sort of public connection in the building, and they got the update for the instrument software, and then they left it there. Because of course it worked connected there. Why would you go further? and that machine got owned. And so they were saying, you know, we'd actually consider permanently attaching this, so that couldn't happen. We thought if we made it small, we'd have an option from Power over Ethernet. That's turned out to be not something people really want. It's also a headless device. We need to add some instrumentation to it. So when we go and work on these things, we take a monitor and a keyboard, and we need to provide some status stuff, and we haven't gotten to that part yet. And then we thought about some stuff in the future. If you've got something there, are there other things that you might want to do with it? So I left it, this slide is old, and I left it in here, even though it's inaccurate, because it brings home a point I want to make later. You know, we do want to protect the instrument and allow remote maintenance. We have sought to leverage existing solutions, but here's one that did not work out. We had some very promising communications with the pfSense folks. pfSense, for those of you who aren't aware, they make both very well-regarded physical firewalls, even little ones, and they also, it's based on an open source project, and their code is open source. And we talked about, you know, their interest in this, and they were interested in things that did not progress. They were working on a new product internally, and their attention shifted away, and we could not be shiny enough to get their attention back. One of the reasons that was very attractive to me is I thought that might be something that would sustain this effort going forward. You know, best outcome is this does provide real value. That's great, but then it's actually supported in some way. Also thought about doing some encrypted tunnel VPN, potentially allowing remote instruments to appear local to campus network. That has turned out not to be a big deal. I just want to check in. Can you guys still hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. That was James Deaton sending me a message. I thought it might have been you guys. So, again, I talked about network test point, implement perfSONAR. We have created an OAMP mesh. I know a lot of people will immediately say, if it's a Raspberry Pi that you're doing this, you know, there's lots of jitter because the Ethernet is essentially a poorly implemented USB Ethernet adapter, and there's lots of jitter in there. And yes, those things are all true. The thing is we were not that interested in fine-grained jitter as much as we wanted to know about loss, and to have something that was running regularly and could tell us about loss. We did look into other solutions that might provide more real-time like capabilities, maybe a BeagleBone. There's nothing that would prevent that. This stuff should run on lots of things pretty easily. Also thought about putting a precision clock on a different device, something that had the ability to didn't have a lot of jitter induced by its onboard networking hardware. And we have, in our beta rollout, we've determined knowing that the perfSONAR is running and knowing if there's loss is good enough, that because these are not huge files, having fine-grained jitter has not been really a problem. So the idea about signing the data would be to take some metadata and the data that's produced by the instrument, compute secure hash of those files, and then get a trusted timestamp on that file. So maybe the instrument generates 5 megabits of data or a gigabyte of data, and you'd get a hash from that. You'd have some metadata might be really simple because it's hard to get people to fill stuff out because these instruments might be used a lot frequently. So the metadata might just be static information, such as, it's this instrument in this room, here's the PI that is in charge of it. And because the metadata is in the file names frequently, that would be in here. We thought this was a really cool idea. I really think it is a good idea. It's been a foreign concept to the researchers so far. And I'll talk more about how this would work in another slide. Oh, yeah, and I went to IU. There's a Steve Meyer who worked in our School of Informatics and as a cybersecurity researcher. He and I talked about how this might work. And one of his ideas was you should have the researchers actually, when they form their hypothesis, they should digitally sign and timestamp that so that you could tell that they had not modified their hypothesis as the data was coming in. I guess a joke.
So one pause, Steve, because somebody had a question that they sent to me. What are the benefits of kind of the in the lab access layer distribution of this versus a central one? Obviously, central would have an economy of scale argument. So what is the counter argument?
So if I understand the argument correctly, maybe you connect these devices to some VLAN that's exposed in the lab, and that VLAN is hauled back to a central place where you provided these functions. So I'm guessing that might be one model. And we thought about that model. And the difficulty is these instruments weren't very static. They're getting smaller, cheaper, they're proliferating more quickly, and this is a solution that you're kind of empowering the user to do something directly to their device, which is something they seem to want to do. So they have these instruments. It's very different. So high performance computing support at IU is very centralized. And so researchers are using computers that are in the data center that they're not even allowed to go in. This is the completely other end of the spectrum. And when we talk about things and say, well, here's this little device that we want to connect in and blah, 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 that was actually appealing to them. Whether it makes the most sense or not, good question. It does provide the test point, which is local. And I think that would be more difficult if you did this centrally. It also doesn't assume any continuous infrastructure other than the normal network connection to the lab. And when I talk about our current, where it's currently being used, I have some more points along that. So hopefully, does that answer the question?
I think so. I haven't seen any follow-up. Yes,
Okay.
it does.
So TrueTimestamp.org. So we were looking at how would you timestamp the data, and I ran across what I thought was a really elegant solution that is being used for medical imagery. So there are radiologists that want to have the ability to say when a particular image was taken for legal reasons. And the way this works is essentially you locally, before you interact with the service, can generate a hash of a file. So you generate a secure hash of an image or some data the instrument's produced, and you fill it, and then you open up your email client, and you type in your name, and you paste in the value of the hash, and you put in whatever else you want in there, and then you submit it to this timestamps service, and it sends back or hands back to you a PGP signed text document, which includes the limited amount of data. So all you had to do was put in, some metadata like who are you and what is this, and then the hash value. And now you get back a document that just includes what you sent, plus a time and date, and that whole thing has been digitally signed using PGP. And the other things that are in that text file are instructions on how to verify it. So they do a pretty good job of not just using one cert and having some resiliency in ensuring the user has the ability later on to verify that it was time and date stamped at that point in the past. So conceptually, this is really simple. And this is, I think, from Wikipedia. Yeah, this is from Wikipedia. So you have your data, you calculate the hash, you send the hash to a timestamp authority, and the timestamp authority essentially just creates a signature of that. And the one that we were looking at just used PGP, and they just send it back. And so now I have this text file, could be one page, and if that text file is presented with the data file, if everyone trusted the timestamp authority, you would know that the hash was generated on that time and date. Not after that time or date. Could have happened beforehand, but not after that time and date. And the only way the file is going to match the hash is if the file has not been modified. So this seems like a pretty simple way, technically simple way, of providing a level of provenance and data integrity assurity for data as it's born out of the instruments. Now the kicker is the timestamp authority has to be something everybody trusts. There are commercial versions of this. I think Adobe offers that service, for example, as do other document management companies. And so anyway, we're not quite there yet with this feature. This feature, again, was something we were excited about, but the researchers were not so much. That I think the bottom line is in terms of metadata and ensuring provenance and all that, the researchers seem to be driven by the requirements of the funding agency. And while, for example, the NSF has, you have to provide a data management plan. If the data management plan said, for example, you have to be able to verify that the integrity of the data, in the future, there would be a lot more interested in this, I think. But it doesn't say that. And this, to our surprise, was a concept that nobody wanted to. If we could make this happen invisibly, that was fine. But this was not very popular.
So another question has come in that's relevant. Have you thought about using a TPM for signing?
That's a good question. The boxes don't have them. I assume we could get them as USB devices or actually embedded in a fancier version of the Raspberry Pi. So it's not clear to me that would provide the same thing. So we wanted to ensure two things. We wanted to ensure the integrity of the data, and you can do that if you assume that trust is not an issue. You can do that a lot of ways. But we wanted to do it with the date and time. And so it's not clear to me that would, you're going to want to have somebody else sign it, a trusted time authority sign it. And so I don't see where the embedded trust stuff would help. And maybe I'm missing something. So you can stop me. Okay, automate to the extent possible, moving data created by at the instrument into the science workflow. So this is also, a little challenging in that the data flows are largely manual. So here's what makes this a little bit different. These instruments are small. They're located throughout the lab, so they're just these accessory boxes people get data off of, and the first thing they do is they put the data sort of in the normal place data is stored for whatever science they're working on, and it's episodic. It's when they run the instrument. Them putting the data there is maybe the same action as them looking at the data. So I run an instrument, it spits out a file, I copy it to a USB drive, and I walk over to my workstation, I plug the USB drive in, and I look at the output file. I might have looked at it on the instrument, but I might look at it, I might move it and look at it. And then I say, okay, it's good or whatever, and I just drag that folder somewhere. So we have the ability for them to securely copy stuff from the and I'll talk about that more in a little bit, but we have an ability to securely move data back and forth, and so they don't have to go up there with the USB drive, so that's good. And it looks like we may implement Box. So right now, the data, the instrument, the controller could be writing data using our device to a box folder. And in our case, which I'll talk later about our sample sizes being small and this leading to some problems, sample sizes meaning not knowing very well if this would help other people, because I'm looking sort of more at use cases. That may be pretty valuable, and we've already talked about how we're going to architect that, and I think we're going to do that. So I'll probably be mumbling in that. Okay, so the biggest thing this thing does is provides secure remote access to the device, and we didn't. This was sort of inspired, making this more of a focus. It was envisioned as a capability, but we got more laser focused on providing this after listening to Tracy Futhy talk about something similar at a previous meeting. So this is a depiction of something that's working now, and by the way, there is code. I'll get to that in a minute. But just to give you an overview of how this works. So we have an instrument, has a controller, generally running Windows, has an Ethernet port. The device in the center here is a Raspberry Pi, and it's running a DHCP server. And so the Windows machine gets a private address from the DHCP server. And then there's a bunch of code running on the Raspberry Pi that some of it comes from something called the Guacamole project, which is a project of the Linux Foundation. Guacamole is a web-based, essentially proxy for remote desktop protocols, RDP being one of them. So if you have something running Guacamole, you can point your web browser at that thing, and then on the back end, it can establish an RDP session with a device. And so you're getting, with just a clientless web browser, you're getting remote desktop connectivity to a network connected device. So Raspberry Pi plugs in, you plug your instrument into it, it gives a lease to the instrument, a single lease to a single instrument. The Raspberry Pi also connects to the campus Wi-Fi network, And the labs have multiple instruments, and if you can say you don't necessarily need a wired Ethernet connection next to the instrument, that's can be a really big bonus that can lower the barrier, and that's another reason why if you're doing it centrally, that would be a drawback. So it connects to the campus Wi-Fi, and it does a bunch of stuff. It gets a V6 and V4 address from the campus network. It registers both of those with a dynamic DNS service. So what that gives you is now I can point my browser to the MiniDMZ, and even though it's getting a dynamic address from the campus Wi-Fi DHCP server, it's registering that address with a dynamic DNS provider. And it's getting V6 and V4 address. So if I'm a V6 client and I point my browser at the device, I'll get a V6 connection to this Raspberry Pi's web server. And from there, we're using, we were doing CAS authentication. We're now doing SAML authentication, SAML and CAS, or CAS. So in our case at IU, everybody's required to use two-factor authentication. So if someone wants to get remote access to this instrument, they have a URL to go to. If they have V6 connectivity, it goes V6. If they only have V4, it goes V4. They get a login page, the standard campus single sign-on page. They log in past that. After they've authenticated, then if they're an authorized user, they are given access to that instrument remotely, and it's like they're sitting in front of it. They also, there's a virtual drive that gets created, and so they can upload and download files from their device, that might be on campus or miles away or at home. They can securely upload and download files to the instrument because the instrument sees a virtual drive that the Raspberry Pi is presenting to it. And in fact, that it's just sort of a logical thing used to facilitate the movement of data. So all of that's working. I won't say it's bug-free. And there's a story about how we got there to get all that working, which I won't tell the whole thing because it's painful. So any questions about this part?
Looks like we don't have any so far.
Okay. We talked about protocol proxy. When we start to move to different beta testers, we're going to look more at this. One thing that I'll say, and I think it's in another slide, this bump in the wire, if it doesn't work, they don't get access to their instrument. And that's a different development environment than, say, working on perfSONAR. While it might be important to have perfSONAR capability, if you deploy something and it breaks, generally speaking, users can continue to do whatever they're doing while you asynchronously figure out what broke and remedy your perfSONAR mesh. When this thing breaks, the user can't get to the instrument, at least can't get to it remotely. And if they start to rely on that, especially for getting files on and off, that becomes a problem. Some of the things we're leveraging, perfSONAR, these are things we have leveraged or plan to leverage in the future or are thinking about leveraging in the future. The point of this was we're trying not to invent much, and we actually did invent some stuff, and that was painful. Again, I talk about this. This is I like to call this long tail science. That's probably not a good word. There are these instruments where the communities that use them, they're used to having their own. And so all of the effort that's gone into making the data more available really just hasn't happened in those communities. It's not that they don't want people to get their data necessarily. It's that they've had a box to generate their data sitting in their lab. And part of, I think part of what they enjoy is having the instrument, that they're using in their lab to produce their data. And these instruments are affordable to do that and portable and all those things. It's not like a gigantic instrument where you're not going to have your own. And so you need to figure out a way to share. And therefore, I think there's a real problem with provenance, metadata. I know a lot of people work on this. I think that for these users, one way to do that is to make the carrot from the funding agencies more enticing. So this was the initial architectural vision. This is what was in our proposal. It's pretty much like this today. So the thing that says MiniDMZ, it uses a virtual sandbox drive for the file transfers. It is a firewall. It does have the perfSONAR running. And the biggest thing that is added to this is the remote access by providing a mechanism to get remote desktop protocol. So you're essentially sitting in front of the instrument. Okay, so we have working code. The link is going to change. I'm losing my grad students at the end of this semester, and so I'm creating a GitHub site. This is a little more complicated than I realized it would be at IU. It'll probably be my personal GitHub site to move this to, but this link works, and it's going to work for some time, and it'll have some pointer that says no go here when that changes. Core features in the current beta: remote desktop access via client with web-based service. That we have that. That's very, the people like this a lot. perfSONAR test node, so that the components of perfSONAR that are, I think they're called the test node something. That's up and running. We created an instance of Mad Dash display in Amazon Web Services. This is kind of an interesting side story. It cost me either $12 or $16 a month to have a pretty reasonably beefy VM running to put that on in AWS. And it would have cost me more to try to do that, and it would have been more difficult to do this locally. We're supporting SAML and CAS authentication. We initially wanted to use the authentication mechanisms in Guacamole. So we started out, Guacamole supported CAS, but it didn't work. So we started writing our own CAS support for Guacamole. That turned out to be pretty hard. Then Guacamole came out with an updated CAS that appeared to work, but it didn't support SAML. And this caught me blindsided because it had been so long since I had dug into the single sign-on technologies and how they are the same and differ, that, to be honest, I sort of conflated CAS and SAML, which is embarrassing. And as soon as we found a beta test site outside of IU that wanted to use SAML, and I'm thinking, oh, that's easy, that'll be an easy change. Well, no, it wasn't, because the CAS support in Guacamole was challenging, and the way SAML, because of the amount of data SAML provides in the assertion, it does it differently, and that was going to be a big architectural change to the way CAS was done in Guacamole. And at that point, I said, we're not doing this with Guacamole anymore. And we already have a reverse Apache proxy. So when you go to the web server, yeah, you're really getting a screen that's served up ultimately by Tomcat, which is the integration of, which is integrated in Guacamole. But you're really passing through an Apache reverse proxy. And we just said, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to do authentication in the reverse proxy. That's just going to work. And we had to figure out a mechanism to ensure that the user authorization component, which we have been doing in Guacamole. So, once I prove I'm Steve Wallace, is Steve Wallace actually allowed to do this? That part, we figure out how to pass essentially the username after a successful authentication from the Apache reverse proxy to Guacamole, and continue to use Guacamole's native admin interface. So when the lab person responsible for the lab wants to add authorized users, they have a nice GUI to do that, and we didn't change that. So that was good. That burn up, that whole thing I told you about, was really very difficult and time consuming. So lessons learned. Developing a turnkey security appliance is harder than I thought. If you have something that is just monitoring stuff or whatever, and it goes down and the instrument is still available, that's a different case than this. So this had us more nervous about including more people in the beta. Luckily, we have really good beta people who are very tolerant. We need larger sample sizes. We accumulated some technical debt. I would have seen the SAML and CAS issues much earlier had we been beta testing at another site sooner. Our security culture has changed since the proposal was submitted. This is kind of interesting. So it all of a sudden became an issue whether I could even have the device on the campus network. So it turned into, reasonably so, people were not being unreasonable, but I use sort of policies as well as their level of enforcement. All of a sudden, people were saying, well, okay, the researchers are used to using this when it's not publicly connected. Why are you doing this? And that, we work through that with them. We now have a relatively formal security operations guide for the device, which is a good thing. But it's changed. And another case of that is the other university that's beta testing it. When we were describing, we're using dynamic DNS, so they can, v6, v4, get a public address, they can access the instrument from anywhere. They were like, no way. We're not giving this thing an address that's accessible off campus. They still were interested in using it, but they were like, no, we can't do that. We wouldn't be allowed to do that. I think the idea of coming up with a reasonable uniform way to provide some protection for these instruments is a good idea. This project is relatively small in this scheme of things. At its conclusion, it's not clear to me it will be sustaining in a way it would need to be. Again, remember, this has to work, so it's kind of a production level thing. I think it's a good thing. I need to think more about how, first of all, verifying that is a good thing, that people would find this valuable, and finding a mechanism to try and sustain it. We'll see. All hope is not lost. And I'm thinking about maybe having a meeting, a virtual meeting, and bringing people together to get more diverse input and figure out, first of all, are there other solutions that are better? Are there components of other solutions that we should incorporate? Is there some common desires, and is there a way to organize around this so that we all benefit and it is sustaining? Those are the big questions, and those are the things I need to work on. And that's it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Steve, and we'll wait for some questions to come in. I have one first, going back to your last slide before that one.
Okay.
I think you said something to the effect of, you don't think it'll translate into sustaining benefit to researchers. So What's the underlying thought there? Because it's changing the process in which they would have to know how to use it, or that it just wouldn't be as useful as the way that they're used to doing it?
So not those things, although those could be problems. I think the thing I'm worrying about is it's an open source project. For those to work, there needs to be continual contributions. People need to use it. People need to fix it, and that takes a sustaining effort that I'm not sure we'll have.
Okay, fair enough. So in terms of hard numbers after testing and getting this in place, do you have any metrics on improvement versus the old method of just using walking the USB drive around? I mean, what sort of improvements did this give to your limited set of researchers that you tested it with?
So that's a really good question, and I don't have a good answer for that. I will tell you a couple, but I will get a good answer for that because that's a really good question. I'll tell you a few things. The ability to train people on how to use the instrument has changed. So if you can access the instrument remotely, there are training you can do that doesn't necessarily involve you opening the instrument up and doing, whatever to it. Some of it is, here's how the user interface works, here's how all this stuff works. That's changed. The idea that you could be home and get data that was left on the instrument because it had been left running to collect data or something like that, that's a big deal. People like that. We now have a log of who's using the instrument, so it's auditable. Although I think that's a big deal. I don't think anybody else does. But that's a good question. I don't have a good answer.
Okay, also fair enough. So what was the total cost of the hardware to put this together?
So it's a Raspberry Pi, and it has a case and a power supply. I don't know, it's $50.
Oh wow, okay. So not even breaking $100 then.
No, it's not very fast, right? So if you have a big data file, I mean, it's fast enough for a lot of things. The newer Raspberry Pi actually looks like it would be nearly an order of magnitude faster, I think, for the way we're using it. Close to that, and no more money.
Okay. Well, I don't see any additional questions, so I'll thank you again for your time today, and we'll make sure that we get this posted online along with the slides that you sent earlier. And thanks everybody for joining, and have a good weekend.
Thanks, everybody.